Tonight, we're diving into something Hollywood has been lying to you about for decades: medieval battles. You've seen the movies: brave knights charging across pristine fields, swords clashing in choreographed duels, heroes cutting through enemies like wheat, emerging with maybe one photogenic cut on their cheekbone. It's all fake. The reality of medieval warfare was so horrifying, so chaotic, and so absolutely disgusting that if you were transported back to an actual battlefield, you'd probably die of shock before anyone even stabbed you. And tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what a real medieval battle was like, from the moment you got conscripted to the moment you either died screaming or somehow survived with injuries that would make you wish you hadn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because we're about to discover why being a medieval soldier was less glory and honor and more. Please God, let me die quickly. Let's start with how you ended up in this nightmare in the first place. Spoiler alert, you probably didn't sign up. In medieval times, most soldiers weren't volunteers. They weren't professional warriors dreaming of glory. They were farmers, laborers, and craftsmen who got a very unwelcome knock on their door one day. That knock was usually from the local lord's bailiff or sergeant, backed by a few armed men, delivering the news that, congratulations, you've been drafted. This was called feudal obligation, or levy. If you were a peasant, and statistically you absolutely were, you owed military service to your lord. Didn't matter if you had crops to harvest, children to feed, or zero interest in having your intestines decorating a French field. Your lord needed bodies for his army, and you were a body. Simple math. The system worked like this. Every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 60 owed military service. In practice, the bailiff usually took men between 18 and 45, though those age limits got fuzzy when the war was going badly. Your local lord had a quota to fill for the king or greater lord he served. If he needed 200 men, he was getting 200 men one way or another. The bailiff would show up in your village with a list. Sometimes the list was predetermined, based on the lord's records of who owed service. Sometimes it was more arbitrary. You, and you. Your opinion wasn't requested. Your circumstances didn't matter. Let's say you're a 30-year-old farmer named William. You've got a wife, 3 children, and 10 acres of land that keeps your family barely above starvation. It's late spring, and you're in the middle of planting season. Miss this planting, and your family doesn't eat next winter. None of that matters. The bailiff reads your name. You have 3 days to report to the assembly point with whatever weapon you can muster. Failure to appear equals desertion. The penalty for desertion? At minimum, you lose your land and your family becomes destitute. At worst, hanging. Sometimes both. They'd hang you and then confiscate your property just to make sure everyone got the message. You might think, well, I'll just run away, hide in the woods, flee to another village where nobody knows me. Good luck with that. Medieval society was tight-knit in ways we can barely comprehend today. Everyone knew everyone, at least by reputation. Villages were small, usually fewer than 200 people. You couldn't vanish into anonymity because anonymity didn't exist. And even if you could disappear, your family couldn't. Collective punishment was a cornerstone of medieval law enforcement. If you deserted, your wife might lose your land. Your children might be sold into servitude to pay the fine for your desertion. Your parents, if they were still alive, might have their property seized. Your brothers might be conscripted in your place. The system was designed deliberately and efficiently to make sure you showed up, because the consequences of running were worse than the consequences of fighting. At least in battle, you might survive. Desert, and you've condemned your entire family. So you report to the assembly point. You're not alone. Hundreds of other men are gathering, all of them with the same expression. Fear poorly disguised as resignation. Some are your neighbors. Others come from villages you've barely heard of. You don't know them. You'll be expected to fight beside them. Trust them with your life, despite being complete strangers. The lucky ones, if you can call them that, were professional soldiers, men-at-arms, career warriors, who'd been fighting since they were old enough to hold a sword. Mercenaries, who sold their services to the highest bidder. These men were maybe 5 to 10% of any given army. They had real training, real experience, real equipment. The rest? Peasant levies. You, farmers, who'd maybe held a spear once during village training exercises, which happened a few times a year and mostly involved drinking and hoping nobody noticed you weren't paying attention. Village military training was supposed to prepare you for this moment. In theory, every Sunday after church, able-bodied men were required to practice with weapons. In practice, it was a joke. The village had maybe 2 decent practice spears and 1 bow with a broken string. The training consisted of an elderly veteran, if your village was lucky enough to have one, showing you how to hold the spear and muttering something about keeping formation. Most of the training time was spent standing around while the Lord's sergeant yelled at everyone. Then you'd go to the tavern and try to forget that someday this pathetic excuse for preparation might be all that stood between you and a French pike. That day has arrived. You are catastrophically unprepared. Now let's talk about the army you're joining. Medieval armies weren't uniform fighting forces. They were collections of retinues, each brought by a different noble. The king might have his household troops. Various dukes, earls, and barons brought their own men. Bishops sometimes contributed soldiers from church lands. Mercenary companies hired by whoever could afford them. All of these groups had different levels of training, different equipment, different levels of motivation, and sometimes different ideas about what they were even fighting for. Unity of command was theoretical at best. The nobles viewed you, the peasant levy, with barely concealed contempt. To them, you weren't really soldiers. You were mobile obstacles, human shields, bodies to absorb arrows and fill out the battle line. So it looked impressive from a distance. Some of these nobles were decent men who understood that peasant soldiers were human beings doing their duty. But many weren't. They saw you as livestock, slightly more valuable than a horse, but far less valuable than their hunting dogs. And here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. Criminals. Medieval armies included significant numbers of criminals, offered pardons in exchange for military service. Empty the prisons, hand the inmates weapons, point them at the enemy. So you're standing in the assembly field, and next to you is Thomas, a farmer from the next village who seems nice enough. On your other side is a man with a nasty scar who was in jail for murder last week and is now your comrade in arms. Behind you is a teenager who looks like he's about to cry. In front of you is a grizzled veteran with 3 fingers missing who keeps muttering to himself. This is your army. This is who you're trusting with your life. The gear you brought with you was pathetic. Most peasant levies showed up with farm tools that had been sharpened into weapons. A billhook for cutting crops, now repurposed for cutting men. A woodsman's axe. A hammer from your workshop. Maybe, if you were lucky, a rusty old sword that your grandfather claimed he took off a dead Frenchman. But really, he probably bought it from a traveling merchant who specialized in selling garbage to gullible peasants. Spears were the most common weapon for levies because they were cheap to make and relatively easy to use. Point the sharp end at the enemy. Keep your distance. Try not to die. That was basically the full extent of spear training. Armor? You're joking, right? Armor cost money. Real armor, mail, plate, anything that might actually stop a blade, cost more money than you'd see in 5 years of farming. A mail shirt cost roughly what you could earn in 2 years if you saved every penny and your family somehow survived without your income. Plate armor, that was for nobility. You might as well wish for a castle and a dragon. So you wore what you could afford, which was almost nothing. A thick wool or leather tunic, if you were lucky. Most men just wore their regular clothes. A linen shirt, wool tunic, maybe a leather jerkin, if they worked in a trade that used one. Some men stuffed their shirts with straw or rags, creating a kind of improvised padding that would, maybe, possibly, if God was feeling generous, slow down a knife. It wouldn't stop it, but slowing it down meant the difference between a survivable wound and a fatal one. The truly desperate wore cooking pots on their heads. I'm not exaggerating for effect. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts both mention men wearing whatever metal they could find as makeshift helmets. A soup pot tied to your skull with leather straps actually did provide some protection against glancing blows. It also made you look ridiculous, but looking ridiculous was better than having your skull split open. Some men fashioned helmets from boiled leather, cuir bouilli, leather soaked in hot water, shaped while soft, then allowed to harden. It was light, cheap, and provided minimal protection, better than nothing, barely. The wealthy peasants, the ones who owned more than the average 10 acres of land, might afford a padded jacket called a gambeson, multiple layers of linen quilted together, stuffed with wool or old rags. A good gambeson could actually stop a weak blade strike or lessen the impact of a blow. But good gambesons were expensive, and most men's gambesons were homemade, poorly constructed affairs that fell apart after one battle. So there you stood, clothed in rags, armed with farm implements, about to face professional soldiers who'd been training for warfare since childhood. The odds were not in your favor. The assembly process took days. Men kept arriving from surrounding villages and towns. The professional soldiers, the men-at-arms, looked at each new group of peasant levies with undisguised disgust. You could see it in their faces. They knew most of you would be dead within a month, and they'd already written you off. The nobles on horseback didn't even look at you. You weren't worth noticing. When they needed to communicate with the levy, they spoke to the sergeants, who translated the orders into language you could understand. usually with a lot of cursing. Food was already a problem. The king's army was supposed to provide provisions, but logistics in medieval times were a nightmare. Supply wagons broke down. Food rotted. Corrupt officials sold supplies and pocketed the money. By the time rations reached you, they were inadequate. You got a daily ration of bread, maybe a pound if you were lucky, and some ale or weak beer. The bread was coarse, made from the cheapest grain, often mixed with sawdust or ground peas to make it stretch further. It tasted like dirt and gave you stomach problems, but it kept you from starving. Meat occasionally, cheese rarely, vegetables almost never. You were essentially starving from the moment you joined the army, slowly burning through your body's reserves. And then came the worst part, the order to march. Medieval armies didn't teleport to the battlefield. They walked for days, weeks, sometimes months. And this march, this seemingly boring part that movies always skip with a quick montage, killed more soldiers than combat ever did. Let's talk about what a medieval military march actually looked like in excruciating detail, because this is where the reality of medieval warfare really hits home. First, the distance. Armies could be marching 50 to 200 miles or more to reach the battlefield. Some campaigns required even longer marches. The English army that fought at Crécy had marched through France for weeks before the battle. Crusader armies walked from Western Europe to the Holy Land, a journey of thousands of miles. A reasonably fit medieval army might cover 15 to 20 miles a day. That sounds manageable until you remember you're carrying everything you own. The roads are terrible, and you're already malnourished and probably sick. 7 to 10 hours of walking every single day. And what are you carrying? Your weapon. A spear. An axe. Something heavy and awkward. Your bedroll, if you have one, which is really just a thin wool blanket that doesn't keep you warm. A sack with whatever food you've managed to scavenge. Some stale bread. Maybe a piece of dried meat, if you're incredibly lucky. A water skin or leather bottle, hopefully full, but probably not. Maybe a cooking pot, perhaps a spare pair of shoes, though most men couldn't afford spares. That's 20 to 40 pounds of gear minimum. For a modern soldier with proper equipment and nutrition, that's manageable. For a medieval peasant who's been living on the edge of malnutrition your entire life, it's brutal. Now, factor in the terrain. Medieval roads were garbage. This cannot be overstated. The Romans had built magnificent roads, engineering marvels of stone and drainage. Most of the time, you're walking on dirt tracks that barely qualify as paths. When it's dry, they're rutted and uneven, full of rocks that turn your ankles and roots that trip you when it rains. And it rains constantly because you're probably marching through northern Europe, where the weather is determined to make you miserable. Those dirt tracks turn into rivers of mud. Medieval mud wasn't like modern mud. This was thick, sucking, boot-stealing mud that could be ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes deeper. You'd step forward and your foot would sink, the mud grabbing your boot with obscene enthusiasm. Pulling your foot free required genuine effort, and sometimes your boot didn't come with it. You'd be walking along, step into a particularly nasty patch, and your boot would stay in the mud while your foot pulled free. Now you had to decide, go back and dig your boot out, which meant stopping the entire column behind you and earning curses from everyone, or keep walking with one bare foot and figure it out later. Most men chose to retrieve the boot, because walking barefoot on medieval roads was a fast track to infected feet, and infected feet meant you couldn't walk, and not being able to walk meant you got left behind, and getting left behind meant death. So you'd hop back on one foot, dig your hand into the cold, wet mud, fish out your boot, which was now twice as heavy with mud inside it, dump out what you could, jam your wet foot back in, and hurry to catch up while the column kept moving. This happened multiple times per day. To everyone, your shoes were falling apart. Medieval peasant shoes were not designed for military campaigns. They were thin leather affairs, sometimes just leather wrapped around your foot and tied with cord. After a few days of constant marching through mud and water, they'd start to disintegrate. The leather would crack, the stitching would come apart, the soles would separate from the uppers. You'd try to repair them at night, using a needle and thread, if you had them. But leather working requires proper tools and dry conditions, neither of which you had. By the end of the first week, many men were walking in shoes held together by prayer and strips of cloth wrapped around them. By the second week, men were walking barefoot, their shoes having completely failed. Walking barefoot sounds bad in theory. In practice, it was a death sentence in slow motion. Your feet would develop blisters within hours. Those blisters would pop, leaving raw, open wounds. Those wounds would get infected because you're walking through mud, animal dung, human waste, and every kind of filth imaginable. Within days, your feet would be swollen, red, oozing pus. The infection would spread. Your lower legs would swell. Red streaks would appear. Sepsis beginning. Without antibiotics, without proper treatment, that infection could kill you. Men died from foot infections during medieval marches. Not occasionally, regularly. They'd start limping, then stumbling, then they couldn't walk at all. And they'd be left by the roadside because the army couldn't stop for one man with bad feet. And we haven't even talked about the weather yet. Medieval campaigns usually happened during the warmer months, late spring, summer, early fall, because winter warfare was even more suicidal. But warmer months in medieval Europe still meant unpredictable weather, frequent rain, and temperatures that could swing from hot to cold in hours. When it rained, and it rained often, you got soaked. Your wool clothes absorbed water like a sponge, becoming heavy and cold. Wet wool doesn't provide warmth. It pulls heat from your body. You'd be walking in clothes that weighed twice what they did dry, shivering constantly, unable to get warm. At night, you'd try to sleep in those wet clothes because you didn't have spare clothes. The wool would gradually dry against your body heat. But by morning, everything would be damp again from dew or more rain. Hypothermia killed soldiers during summer marches, not from blizzards or winter conditions, but from being constantly wet and cold, their bodies gradually losing the ability to maintain temperature. You'd see men start shivering uncontrollably, then stumbling, then collapsing. If their friends didn't warm them up quickly, they'd die. When it was hot, and sometimes it got genuinely hot, particularly during campaigns in Spain or southern France, you had different problems. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration. You'd be marching under the sun, sweating profusely, losing water faster than you could replace it, because water sources were limited and often contaminated. Men would collapse from heat, their brains cooking inside their skulls. They'd become confused, aggressive, then unconscious. Most of them died. And then there were the insects. Medieval Europe was full of insects, and a marching army attracted them like nothing else. Flies swarmed around you constantly, attracted by the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies, the latrine areas that formed wherever the army stopped, the food being carried that was going rotten. The flies would land on your face, crawl into your mouth and nose, lay eggs in any open wounds you had. Those eggs would hatch into maggots, which actually helped clean wounds in some cases. But the psychological horror of having maggots living in your flesh was considerable. Mosquitoes bred in the puddles and streams along the route. They'd swarm at dusk and dawn, biting every exposed piece of skin. The bites would itch terribly, and scratching them with dirty hands meant infection. Men would have hundreds of mosquito bites, their skin red and swollen, some bites becoming infected, abscesses, lice. Everyone had lice. These weren't modern, relatively rare lice. These were medieval lice, and they were everywhere, in your hair, in your beard if you had one, in your clothes, in your bedding. They lived in the seams of your garments, laying eggs by the hundreds. Lice bites itch constantly. You'd be scratching all day, every day. The scratching would break the skin, creating entry points for infection. And worse, lice carried typhus, a disease that killed millions during medieval times. Typhus started with a severe headache and high fever. Then came a rash starting on your trunk and spreading outward. Then delirium, confusion, organ failure, death. Once typhus got into an army, it spread like wildfire because everyone had lice and everyone was in close contact. You'd see men develop the fever, and everyone would back away from them, knowing what was coming. The sick man would be delirious within days, raving, not recognizing anyone. Then he'd collapse and die, usually within a week or two of the first symptoms. The body would be left by the roadside. Nobody had time or energy for proper burial. The army marched on, and the corpse stayed behind, food for scavengers. But the biggest killer was dysentery, the bloody flux. This disease, more than any other, destroyed medieval armies before they ever reached the battlefield. Dysentery is caused by contaminated water or food, and medieval armies had both in abundance. Water sources along the march were often stagnant ponds, streams that animals drank from and defecated in, or wells that served villages with poor sanitation. The army's water discipline was non-existent. Men would drink from whatever water they could find because dehydration would kill you faster than dysentery. Sometimes you got lucky and the water was clean. Usually it wasn't. Food was often contaminated with fecal matter, either from unwashed hands preparing it or from flies that had been crawling on human waste and then landed on your bread. Once you contracted dysentery, your life became focused entirely on your bowels. The disease caused intense, frequent diarrhea, not the mild inconvenience of modern food poisoning. Medieval dysentery meant you'd be liquid 20, 30, 40 times a day. You'd lose massive amounts of fluid and electrolytes. Dehydration would set in fast. Your mouth would be dry, your eyes sunken, your skin loose and papery. You'd be weak, barely able to walk, and the diarrhea wouldn't stop. The pain was constant. Stomach cramps that doubled you over, burning as the acidic liquid tore at your already raw anus. Blood in your stool, which meant the intestinal lining was being destroyed. You'd try to keep marching because stopping meant being left behind, but eventually you couldn't. You'd collapse lying in your own filth, too weak to move, while the army marched past you. Some men recovered, most didn't. Dysentery killed thousands upon thousands of medieval soldiers. During some campaigns, up to 30 or 40% of the army died from disease before ever reaching the enemy. And here's the worst part. Even if you personally didn't get sick, you had to live with the results. The smell of an army on the march was indescribable. Thousands of men, none of whom had bathed in weeks, many of whom had dysentery, all packed together. The smell of sweat, of unwashed bodies, of rotting teeth and bad breath. The smell of infected wounds, of gangrene setting in. The smell of the latrine areas, where men would dig shallow pits and relieve themselves in them until the pits were overflowing, then dig new pits. The smell of death from the bodies left along the roadside, bloating in the sun. You couldn't escape it. It was in your clothes, in your hair, in your nostrils constantly. After a while, you stopped noticing it consciously, but it was always there, a miasma of human misery. Sleeping on the march was a nightmare. The army would stop each evening as the sun set because marching in the dark was too dangerous. Men would stumble around, fall into holes, get separated and lost. You'd stop in whatever field or forest the commanders had chosen. There was no camp infrastructure, no tents for common soldiers. You'd find a relatively flat piece of ground, spread out your blanket if you had one, and lie down. The ground was usually wet, cold, and full of rocks. You'd stand in the darkness, exhausted, hungry, trying to stay awake and alert when your body was screaming for rest. The sounds of the camp at night were disturbing. Thousands of men trying to sleep, coughing, snoring, groaning in pain from injuries or sickness. Men with dysentery would get up repeatedly to relieve themselves, stumbling around in the dark. You'd hear them retching, vomiting, crying. Some nights you'd hear screaming. Someone's infected wound had become unbearable, or they were delirious with fever, or they'd woken from a nightmare and couldn't remember where they were. Morning came too soon. You'd be woken by shouted commands, drums, horns. You'd get up, every muscle aching, joints stiff, feeling worse than when you'd lain down. Breakfast, if there was any, would be a piece of stale bread and some questionable water. Then you'd start marching again. Another day, another 20 miles, another step closer to the battle that was waiting for you. The psychological toll of the march was severe. Day after day of pain, hunger, sickness, exhaustion, watching your friends die from disease, knowing that even if you survived the march, the battle was still coming. Some men broke mentally. They'd start raving, talking nonsense, seeing things that weren't there. The stress combined with malnutrition and possible disease would push them into delirium or genuine madness. Others became completely passive, what we'd now call dissociation. They'd keep marching because that's what everyone else was doing. But there was no conscious thought behind it. They'd become automatons, following orders mechanically, their minds gone somewhere else to escape the horror of their situation. And through all of this, you hadn't even reached the enemy yet. This was just the journey to the battlefield. The actual fighting, which everyone feared, was still to come. Historical records are full of campaigns where armies arrived at the battlefield having lost a third of their strength to disease and desertion. The 100 Years' War saw armies devastated by sickness during the march. The Crusades lost thousands of men to disease before they even reached the Holy Land. During Edward III's campaign in France, his army of 15,000 men was reduced to less than 10,000 by the time they reached Crécy, and only a fraction of those losses were from combat. The rest died on the march. This was standard. This was expected. And it was just the beginning. So, you've somehow survived the march. You're sick, exhausted, half-starved, and your feet look like raw meat, wrapped in strips of leather that used to be shoes. Congratulations. Now, let's talk about the absolute disaster of an army you're part of. Medieval armies were not well-organized fighting machines. They were barely controlled mobs, held together by fear of punishment and the vague hope that you might actually survive this. Let's start with the command structure, or the lack thereof. At the very top, you had the king, or the great lord, who'd called this army together. He was surrounded by his household knights, advisors, maybe a few professional military men who actually understood tactics. These people made the decisions about where to march, when to fight, and what the overall strategy would be. Below the king were the various nobles who'd brought their own retinue. A duke might bring 500 men, an earl might bring 200, a baron might bring 50. Each of these nobles commanded his own men and theoretically took orders from the king. In practice, it was complicated. Medieval politics meant that some nobles were only technically loyal. They had their own agendas, their own territorial disputes, their own ideas about how the campaign should be conducted. If the king ordered something they disagreed with, they might ignore it or follow it half-heartedly, or even refuse outright. This caused massive problems during actual combat. You'd have one part of the army advancing, while another part held back, because their commander didn't like the plan. Or different contingents would refuse to coordinate, because their lords were rivals back home. Below the nobles were the knights and men-at-arms, the professional warriors. These were the guys who actually knew what they were doing. They'd been trained for warfare since childhood, practicing with weapons for hours every day, learning mounted combat, understanding tactics and strategy, but they were vastly outnumbered by everyone else. Everyone else was you, the peasant levy, the mob of farmers and laborers who'd been handed weapons and told to stand in formation. Here's the fundamental problem. You didn't train together. The men in your company came from different villages, different regions, sometimes different countries. You didn't know each other. You hadn't practiced fighting as a unit. You had no experience working together under stress. Trust in combat is everything. You need to know that the man beside you will hold his position, that he'll watch your flank, that he won't run when things get scary. But you don't know these men. For all you know, the guy next to you will break at the first enemy charge, leaving you exposed and alone. And then there's the language problem. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of different languages and dialects that were mutually unintelligible. An English army might include English speakers from various regions with dialects so different they could barely understand each other. Welsh soldiers speaking Welsh, a completely different language. Cornish speakers with their Celtic tongue. Irish mercenaries speaking Gaelic. French-speaking Norman knights. Flemish crossbowmen. Maybe some German or Italian mercenaries. How do you coordinate tactics when half your army can't understand the commands being shouted? You don't. You rely on simple universal signals, horns, drums, banners, and hope everyone figures it out. This caused catastrophic problems. Commands got confused. Men didn't know where to go or what to do. Formations fell apart because people were following different orders or no orders at all. A commander would shout, "Advance," in Norman French. The English-speaking soldiers might understand, but the Welsh contingent had no idea what was being said. They'd look around, see some men moving forward, and maybe follow along, or maybe stand there confused until a sergeant physically shoved them forward. In the chaos of battle, communication became almost impossible. Once the fighting started, you couldn't hear verbal commands anymore. Everything was screaming. The clash of weapons, the thunder of horses, visual signals were all that worked, and even those could be missed or misinterpreted. Discipline was maintained through fear and violence. Medieval military justice was swift, brutal, and meant to terrify everyone else into obedience. Step out of line, question an order, or God forbid, try to desert, and you'd face punishment that ranged from flogging to execution. The punishments were carried out publicly in front of the entire army to make sure everyone understood what happened to disobedient soldiers. Flogging meant being tied to a post or wagon wheel and whipped with a leather scourge or a cane. The beatings were severe enough to leave permanent scars, sometimes severe enough to kill. Men would pass out from the pain, be revived, and the beating would continue. Desertion was punished with hanging. Usually, you'd be strung up from a tree, in full view of the army, left to slowly strangle to death. It wasn't a quick death. Hanging by the neck without a drop to break it meant you'd spend minutes thrashing, gasping for air, your face turning purple before you finally died. Sometimes deserters were beheaded instead, which was considered a more honorable death, and usually reserved for soldiers who had at least shown some previous valor. The execution would be done with a sword or axe, and if the executioner was skilled, it would be quick. If not, well, it might take several blows to sever the head completely. The point wasn't just to punish the individual, it was to send a message to everyone else. This is what happens when you disobey. Stay in line or die. But fear only works so far when everyone's exhausted, starving, and facing probable death anyway. Medieval armies were always on the edge of collapse, held together by the thinnest threads of coercion and shared misery. Morale was fragile. Soldiers fought for different reasons: feudal obligation, loyalty to a specific lord, promises of plunder, or just because running away meant death. None of those motivations made men eager to die. Everyone was looking for any excuse to avoid actual combat. Some men would inflict injuries on themselves to avoid fighting: a deliberately broken finger, a self-inflicted cut that got infected, anything that would make them unable to fight without technically being desertion. The commanders knew this happened and dealt with it harshly when they caught someone, but it kept happening because the alternative was battle. Now, let's talk about camp life in the days before battle, because this is where the real horror of medieval armies becomes apparent. Medieval military camps were hellscapes of filth and disease. Imagine thousands of men crammed into fields with zero sanitation infrastructure, no latrines, no organized waste disposal, no understanding of hygiene. Where did men relieve themselves? Anywhere. Designated areas formed naturally, usually the edges of camp, where men would go to defecate and piss. But these weren't proper latrines. They were just areas where human waste accumulated in piles. The smell was beyond description. If you've ever smelled a portable toilet at a music festival in August, multiply that by 1,000 and you're getting close. The stench of thousands of men's waste, rotting in the sun, mixing with the mud, attracting flies and clouds so thick they looked like smoke. And the waste was everywhere, not just in the latrine areas. At night, in the dark, men would stumble a few feet from where they slept and relieve themselves. In the morning, you might wake up to find that someone had defecated right next to where your head had been resting. The camps bred disease like nothing else. Dysentery spread rapidly. Typhoid fever, another waterborne illness, killed thousands. Respiratory infections passed from man to man in the close quarters. Men would be fine in the morning and dead by nightfall. The progression of disease was sometimes shockingly fast. You'd see a man coughing at breakfast, feverish by midday, delirious by evening, and dead by dawn. The bodies had to be dealt with. In the early days of a campaign, there might be an attempt at proper burial. Mass graves would be dug at the edge of camp, and bodies would be thrown in and covered with dirt. But as more men died, and the army grew tired, even that basic courtesy disappeared. Bodies would be dragged to the edge of camp and left to rot. The smell of decomposition would add another layer to the already unbearable stench. The camp followers made everything more complicated. Every medieval army dragged along a massive tail of non-combatants. These weren't just wives and prostitutes, though there were plenty of both. There were merchants selling overpriced food and equipment, blacksmiths offering to repair weapons and armor, priests hearing confessions and offering spiritual comfort, surgeons ready to saw off limbs, opportunistic thieves waiting to rob anyone who looked vulnerable. These camp followers could outnumber the actual soldiers. For every fighting man, there might be one or two non-combatants trailing along. They created their own economy within the army, buying and selling, trading services, sometimes stealing. The prostitutes were a major presence. Medieval armies attracted sex workers like battlefields attracted crows. These women, and sometimes young men, followed the army from place to place, offering their services to soldiers who had coin and wanted temporary comfort before possibly dying. The conditions these sex workers lived in were appalling. They had no protection, no rights, no recourse if soldiers became violent. They were often treated as subhuman, beaten, robbed, sometimes killed, and they spread disease. Syphilis wouldn't arrive in Europe until the late 15th century, but gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted infections were rampant. Soldiers would visit the camp prostitutes, contract infections, and then suffer for weeks with painful urination, discharge, and sores. There was no treatment. The infections would sometimes resolve on their own, but often they'd cause long-term damage or spread to other parts of the body. The merchants were often as dangerous as enemy soldiers. They'd sell rotten food at inflated prices. Knowing soldiers had no choice but to buy it, they'd offer loans at usurious rates. They'd fence stolen goods, often goods stolen from the army's own supply train. Some merchants were spies, gathering information about the army's strength, condition, and intentions to sell to the enemy. Nobody trusted them, but everyone needed them because the army's official supply system was inadequate. The priests moved through camp, offering religious services. Mass was held every day, and soldiers were expected to attend. Confessions were heard constantly, especially as the army got closer to battle. Men wanted to die with clean souls, absolved of their sins. The surgeons terrified everyone. Medieval surgery was butchery, performed by men with minimal training and terrible tools. Soldiers knew that if they were wounded badly enough to need a surgeon, they'd probably die either from the wound or from the surgery itself. But the surgeons followed the army anyway, setting up their tents with their saws and cauterizing irons, waiting for the inevitable casualties. At night, the camp became even worse. Fires burned everywhere, creating a landscape of flickering shadows and smoke. Men gambled, fighting over dice and cards, sometimes killing each other over disputed games. Drunkenness was common because alcohol was one of the few pleasures available. The drinking led to fights, not playful scuffles, but genuine violence. Men would beat each other half to death over insults, over gambling debts, over women, over nothing at all. The violence was a release, a way to channel the fear and frustration of waiting for battle. Guards tried to maintain order, but there were never enough of them. The camps at night were lawless zones where the strong preyed on the weak. Your belongings would be stolen if you didn't guard them constantly. Your food would disappear. If you looked vulnerable, you'd be robbed, beaten, or worse. Some soldiers formed protective groups, small bands of men who watched each other's backs. But these groups were often as much gangs as protective associations, shaking down weaker soldiers for protection money. And through it all, you're trying to prepare mentally for battle, knowing that in a day or two, you're going to be expected to stand in a line and fight trained killers. Your equipment is still inadequate. You've checked your weapon 100 times, sharpening the blade with a whetstone, fixing the loose handle with strips of leather, hoping it doesn't break the first time you hit something solid. Your armor, such as it is, hasn't improved. You've tried to patch the holes in your padded jacket. You've stuffed more rags into your shirt for padding. It's not enough. You know it's not enough, but it's all you have. The professional soldiers, the men-at-arms and knights, exist in a completely different world. They have real armor, mail hauberks, or even plate if they're wealthy enough. The armor is custom fitted, maintained by servants, cleaned and repaired regularly. They have war horses, massive destriers, trained specifically for warfare. These horses cost a fortune, as much as a village might produce in a year. They were bred for size, strength, and aggression. In battle, a war horse was a weapon itself, trained to bite and kick enemies. The knights have squires to maintain their equipment, cook their food, set up their tents. They eat better food than you. They sleep in tents with actual bedding. When they defecate, they do it in chamber pots that servants empty for them. They treat you with the same regard they'd show a donkey. Actually, less regard. A good donkey was valuable. You were replaceable. Some of these knights are decent men who understand that peasant soldiers are human beings doing their duty. These knights treat their men fairly, make sure they're fed as well as possible, and try to protect them in battle. But many aren't. Many see you as subhuman, as tools to be used and discarded. They'll ride past you without acknowledging your existence. They'll take the best food and leave you with scraps. In battle, they'll use you as shields, sending you forward to absorb arrows, while they wait for the perfect moment to charge. You resent them deeply, bitterly resent them, but you can't do anything about it because they have swords and armor and horses and the full backing of the social order. So, you sit in the mud, in the filth, surrounded by dying men and desperate camp followers, waiting for the battle that might kill you tomorrow. You try to sleep, but can't. You try to eat, but your stomach is too tight with fear. You think about home, your wife, if you have one, your children, your fields. All of it feels impossibly distant, like a dream you had once but can't quite remember clearly, and you wonder if you'll ever see any of it again. The battle is tomorrow. Everyone knows it. Scouts have reported enemy positions just a few miles away. The commanders have held their councils. Orders have been issued. And now, as the sun sets on what might be your last evening alive, the reality of what's about to happen finally, truly, completely sets in. This is the night nobody talks about in the legends. No songs are sung about the evening before the battle, when thousands of men collectively realize they're probably going to die. No tapestries depict the terror, the desperate prayers, the quiet sobbing in the darkness. But this night was real, and for medieval soldiers, it was often worse than the battle itself. Let's start with the confessions. Medieval soldiers were genuinely, deeply religious in ways modern people struggle to understand. They believed in God, in heaven and hell, in the very real possibility that dying without absolution meant eternal damnation. The fear of hell was as real and immediate as the fear of the enemy army. So before every major battle, priests moved through the camp hearing confessions. The lines were long, hundreds of men waiting their turn to whisper their sins to a priest they'd probably never see again. The confessions were heartbreaking. Men would confess to adultery, to stealing from their neighbors, to hating their lords, to doubting God during moments of despair. They'd confess to sins, both great and small, desperate to clear their souls before they died. Some men hadn't been to confession in years. They'd accumulated so many sins that the confession took hours. The priest would listen patiently, occasionally asking questions, trying to understand the depth of the spiritual burden this man was carrying. The priests granted absolution mechanically. After a while, they couldn't maintain emotional engagement with hundreds of identical confessions. Say 10 Our Fathers, 5 Hail Marys, and go in peace. Your sins are forgiven. Next man. But for the soldiers, this absolution was everything. Knowing that their souls were clean, that if they died tomorrow, they'd go to heaven, provided the only real comfort available. Some men couldn't wait for a priest. They confessed to each other, to their friends, sobbing and asking forgiveness for old grudges and petty arguments. Friendships that had been strained were suddenly mended because nobody wanted to die with bad blood between them. You'd see grown men embracing, crying, telling each other things they'd never said before. I've always respected you. You're the best friend I've ever had. I'm sorry for that time I stole your bread. The intensity of emotion was overwhelming. Mass was held in the evening. Thousands of men knelt in the muddy fields as priests elevated the host, blessing the army, promising that God favored their cause, that dying in battle was dying for God. The priests would give sermons about the righteousness of the war. The enemy were heretics or invaders or godless men who deserved to die. Your cause was just. God was watching. Fight well, and heaven awaited. Both sides did this, of course. Both armies had priests promising that God was on their side. Nobody mentioned the logical impossibility of this. Or if they did, they didn't mention it loudly. After the religious ceremonies came the practical preparations. You checked your weapon again and again and again. You'd already checked it 100 times, but you couldn't stop. You'd run your finger along the blade, testing the sharpness. You'd flex the shaft, making sure it wasn't cracked. You'd adjust the grip, wrap it with extra cloth to prevent slipping. This wasn't about the weapon needing checking. It was about doing something, anything, to keep your mind occupied and your hands busy. Because if you stopped, if you sat still and let your thoughts run free, the fear would overwhelm you. Some men tried to eat, but food turned to ash in their mouths. The body knows when it's in danger, and digestion becomes a low priority. Soldiers before battle often couldn't keep food down. They'd force themselves to eat a piece of bread, and minutes later, they'd be vomiting it back up. The smell of vomit mixed with the existing stench of the camp. Men were throwing up from anxiety all around you, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. Some men wrote letters home if they were literate. Most weren't. Medieval peasants couldn't read or write, so they found a scribe or a clerk, someone who could write, and dictated messages. Tell my wife I love her. Make sure the children know I thought of them at the end. Tell them to be good, to work hard, to remember me. The scribes would write these words down, knowing that most of these letters would never be delivered. The man dictating would probably die tomorrow, and his letter would be lost, stolen, or destroyed. Others tried to sleep, knowing they desperately needed rest, but finding it impossible. You'd lie on the ground, staring at the stars, listening to the sounds of thousands of other men who also couldn't sleep, coughing, praying, weeping quietly in the darkness. The sound of men moving to the latrine areas to empty their nervous bowels. The jingle of equipment as someone else checked their gear for the 1,000th time. The fear was a physical thing. It sat in your stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. Your hands shook. Your heart raced. You'd feel like you couldn't get enough air, like you were suffocating even though you were outside under an open sky. Some men defecated themselves from terror, unable to control their bowels. This was common enough that nobody made fun of it. Everyone understood. Everyone was terrified. The darkness made everything worse. In the daylight, you could see the men around you, could gauge the situation, could feel like you had some control. But at night, in the darkness, your imagination filled in the gaps with horrors. You'd imagine the battle. You'd picture yourself being cut down in the first seconds. You'd envision a sword splitting your skull, or a spear punching through your chest, or being trampled under horses' hooves. The images would play in your mind over and over, each one more vivid and terrible than the last. Desertion attempts spiked the night before battle. Men would try to slip away in the darkness, hoping to vanish into the countryside and make their way home. Most got caught. Sentries were doubled on the night before battle, specifically to prevent desertion. Guards patrolled the camp perimeter, watching for anyone trying to leave. They had orders to stop deserters by any means necessary. If you were caught trying to desert, you'd be dragged back to camp and held under guard until morning. Then, as the army assembled for battle, you'd be executed in full view of everyone. The executions were meant to be a deterrence. A deserter would be brought forward, forced to kneel and beheaded, or hanged while the entire army watched. The message was clear. This is what happens when you run. Die in battle, and at least you die with honor. Run, and you die in shame. and your family bears the disgrace forever. But the threat of execution didn't stop everyone. Some men were so terrified that death by execution seemed preferable to death in battle. At least execution was quick and certain. Battle was prolonged terror, followed by possible death and agony. So you stayed, not because you were brave, but because all your options were terrible. And this one was at least socially acceptable. Your friends were staying, your village mates were staying. If you ran and they died, and you somehow made it home, you'd never be able to face their families. The social pressure was immense. Cowardice was the worst possible shame in medieval society. You could be poor, ugly, stupid, but if you were at least brave, you had honor, run from battle, and you had nothing. So, you lay in the darkness, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to run, waiting for dawn. The knights and nobles in their tents were having a different experience. They ate real food, roasted meat, fresh bread, wine. They made final adjustments to their armor, their squires helping them into the complex assemblies of metal plates and mail. Some of them were nervous too. Even experienced knights felt fear before battle, but they hid it better. They'd been trained for this since childhood. They knew what to expect. They had confidence in their armor, their weapons, their horses, and they knew that if things went badly, they could surrender. Knights rarely killed other knights in battle if they could capture them instead. A captured knight meant ransom money. So, even if they lost, even if they were defeated, they'd probably survive. You didn't have that option. Common soldiers weren't worth ransoming. If you were captured, you'd be killed or enslaved. There was no third option. As midnight passed and the early hours of morning approached, the camp grew quieter. Some men had managed to fall into exhausted sleep. Others lay awake, counting the hours until dawn. You might pray, not the rote prayers you'd learned as a child, but desperate, personal pleas. God, please let me survive. Please let me see my family again. Please don't let me die tomorrow. Please, please, please. The repetition of prayer was soothing. It gave you something to focus on besides the fear. Some men prayed continuously through the night, their lips moving in constant whispered entreaties to God, to Mary, to the saints, to anyone who might listen. Others made bargains with God. If you let me survive, I'll never sin again. I'll go on pilgrimage. I'll give money to the poor. I'll be a better person. Just let me live through tomorrow. These bargains were forgotten by the survivors almost immediately after the battle. But in the moment, they felt binding and sacred. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the camp stirred to life. No one had really slept. Men rose, pissed one last time, checked their equipment one final time, said quiet goodbyes to friends. Breakfast, if there was any, was bread and ale. Your stomach was too tight to eat much. The ale helped a little, numbing the edges of the fear, but not enough. Nothing could be enough. And then came the sound everyone had been dreading. The horns, the drums, the shouted commands. Form up. Get in line. Move, you bastards. The enemy is close. Time to go to war. The battle was beginning. Forming a medieval battle line was less like an orderly military maneuver and more like herding terrified cats into a formation that vaguely resembled an army. Commands were shouted in multiple languages, none of which half the army understood. Form up. Get in line. Move, you bastards. Sergeants and veteran soldiers physically shoved men into position, screaming at anyone who hesitated. using the butts of spears or their fists to move people faster. You stumbled into your place in the formation, surrounded by men you barely knew. Your heart was hammering so hard you could hear it in your ears, louder than the shouts, louder than the drums. The professional soldiers, the men at arms, took positions at the front and flanks where the real fighting would happen. They were calm, or at least appeared calm, checking their weapons with practiced efficiency. The peasant levies, you, were packed into the center and rear. You were there to add weight to the formation, to make the line look impressive, to absorb arrows and enemy charges, while the professionals did the actual fighting. Medieval battle formations varied by time period and region, but most followed similar principles. The basic formation was a line several ranks deep. The front rank held spears or pole arms, points facing forward. The ranks behind them had whatever weapons they'd brought, ready to step forward and fill gaps when the front rank died. And they would die. Everyone knew it. Being in the front rank was a death sentence. The line wasn't straight. It wavered and bulged as men jostled for position, everyone trying to avoid being at the very front, while not looking like cowards. Sergeants walked behind the formation, watching for anyone trying to slip to the rear. Their job, to keep you in place by force if necessary. The spacing was claustrophobic. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping when they had shields. This was intentional. A tight formation was harder to break, but it also meant you couldn't move. You were locked in place by the bodies around you, unable to advance or retreat without everyone else moving too. If you were lucky, you stood next to someone you knew, a man from your village maybe, or someone you'd befriended during the march. Having a familiar face nearby helped. You could exchange glances, nod to each other, offer silent encouragement. If you were unlucky, you stood next to strangers who were just as terrified as you, or worse, next to one of those eerily calm men who'd accepted death and now stood waiting with blank faces, already gone somewhere else in their minds. The smell was overwhelming. Thousands of unwashed bodies packed tight, sweating with fear. The smell of the camp, rot, smoke, filth, clung to everyone. Some men had already pissed themselves. Others were vomiting from terror, the sick splashing onto the muddy ground. You could hear men praying around you. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. The words tumbled out in desperate whispers, over and over, a lifeline to cling to. Across the field, maybe 300 to 500 yards away, the enemy was forming their own line. From this distance, they were just a dark, shifting mass. You couldn't see individual faces, just a wall of men, bristling with weapons, waiting to kill you. Both armies were doing the same thing, shouting to build courage, trying to look intimidating, hoping the other side would break and run before the actual fighting started. War cries rose from both formations, for God and the King, Saint George, Montjoie, whatever rallying cry your side used, shouted by thousands of throats simultaneously, creating a roar that was meant to terrify the enemy and strengthen your own resolve. Banners waved above the formations, your Lord's colors marking where his retinue stood, saints' symbols, reminders that God was supposedly watching. The banners were important. They showed you where your commander was, where you should move toward if the formation broke. War drums began their rhythmic pounding. Boom, boom, boom. The sound was designed to keep men moving in sync. and to strike fear into the enemy. The vibrations traveled through the ground, through your body, merging with your own frantic heartbeat. The knights, mounted on their massive war horses, formed up on the flanks, or in a separate group behind the line. They'd charge at a key moment, smashing into the enemy like a living battering ram. Until then, they waited, looking magnificent in their armor while you stood in the mud, wondering why you couldn't have been born rich. Archers, if your army had them, moved to the front or flanks. English longbowmen with their massive 6-foot bows. French crossbowmen, slower to reload, but powerful. They'd loose their missiles first, trying to thin out the enemy before the melee began. And you waited. This part, the waiting, was psychological torture. You stood there, maybe for 10 minutes, maybe for an hour, watching the enemy, knowing what was coming, unable to do anything but wait for the order to advance. Your legs trembled, not from fatigue, but from fear so intense your body was literally shaking. You tried to control it. You didn't want the men around you to see how terrified you were. But everyone was shaking. Everyone. Your grip on your weapon was too tight. Your knuckles white. Your hands were sweating despite the cold. You'd adjust your grip, wipe your palms on your tunic, and grab the weapon again, over and over. You tried to remember the training, the few times you'd practiced with the village militia. Thrust with the spear. Keep your shield up if you had one. Stay in formation. Don't break the line. But the training had been inadequate, over too quickly, taught by men who barely knew more than you. You weren't ready for this. Nobody had ever been ready for this. Some men prayed aloud now, not caring who heard. Hail Mary, full of grace. Others cursed, a steady stream of profanity, trying to channel fear into anger. Still others just stood in silence, faces pale, eyes wide, already looking dead. You could see the enemy more clearly now. Individual men, their faces obscured by distance, but their intentions clear. They were here to kill you, not because they hated you personally. They didn't know you, but because that's what war was. Killing strangers who'd been designated as enemies. And then from the front, from the commanders on horseback, came the command everyone had been dreading. Advance. The line lurched forward. Moving thousands of men forward in anything resembling a formation was nearly impossible. But somehow, through shouting and shoving and the sheer momentum of the mass, the line began to advance. You walked forward, step by step, trying to keep pace with the men around you. The ground was uneven, churned by previous armies, scarred by old campsites. You stumbled over roots, rocks, the charred remains of fires. Your mouth was dry despite the ale you'd drunk that morning. Your tongue felt thick, stuck to the roof of your mouth. You tried to swallow but couldn't. The enemy line was getting closer. What had been a distant mass was now resolving into individual men. You could see their faces now, or at least the parts not covered by helmets and mail. They looked terrified, just like you. This realization didn't help. Knowing that the man across from you was equally scared didn't make him less dangerous. If anything, it made things worse. A terrified man with a weapon is unpredictable, desperate, capable of anything. As the distance closed to about 300 yards, the archers on both sides began their work. The English longbowmen, if your army had them, were devastating. These men had trained with bows since childhood, developing the massive shoulder and back muscles required to pull a 150 lb draw weight. They could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, sending a storm of bodkins and broadheads into the enemy formation. The sound of a mass archery barrage is distinctive. First, the creaking of hundreds of bowstrings being drawn. Then, the simultaneous release, a sound like a giant's exhale. Then, the hiss and whistle of arrows in flight, filling the air with a sound like wind through trees, but sharper, more malevolent. You watched the arrows arc into the sky from your side, a dark cloud rising, and then beginning to descend toward the enemy. For a moment, they seemed to hang, suspended, blotting out the sun. Then they fell. The arrows hit the enemy formation with a sound of hail on a thatched roof, but louder, more irregular. Thunk, 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 thunk. Each sound was an arrow finding a target, shield, armor, flesh. Screams rose from the enemy ranks. Men went down, some silently falling like puppets with cut strings. Others screamed high and terrible, clutching at shafts protruding from shoulders, faces, legs. The enemy line wavered, but kept moving forward. And then their archers returned fire. You saw the arrows rising from their side, a dark cloud growing larger coming toward you. For a split second, some distant part of your brain thought, "That's beautiful," in a disconnected, dreamlike way. Then the arrows arrived, and beauty became nightmare. The sound was everywhere at once. Arrows hitting shields with solid thunks. Arrows punching through leather and wool with wet, tearing sounds. Arrows hitting men. The man 3 ranks ahead of you took an arrow through the throat. You saw it happen. One moment, he was walking forward, gripping his spear. The next, a yard-long shaft was protruding from his neck, blood spraying in arterial spurts, painting the men around him red. He made a sound you'd never heard before, and never wanted to hear again. Not a scream, not a gasp, just a wet, gurgling noise as he tried to breathe through a throat full of blood. He fell to his knees, hands clutching at the arrow, trying to pull it free, but only making it worse. Then he fell forward, twitching, and the men behind him stepped over his body and kept walking, because stopping meant dying right here. Another arrow hit someone's shield, right next to you. The impact was violent, the arrow punching through the wood and emerging on the other side, the tip inches from the man's face. He flinched, stumbled, but kept his shield up. More arrows fell. A man to your left took one in the thigh, the broadhead slicing through muscle and sticking in bone. He screamed and fell, and you had to step around him, trying not to look at his face as he clutched at his leg, blood pumping between his fingers. An arrow grazed your shoulder, tearing fabric and skin, but not penetrating deep. The pain was sharp, immediate, but adrenaline muted it. You'd feel it later, if there was a later. The formations kept walking toward each other, arrows falling constantly now. Both sides' archers were loosing as fast as they could, trying to thin the enemy before melee began. Men dropped continuously. Some fell dead. Others fell wounded, screaming, thrashing. The ones behind couldn't stop. They walked over the fallen, sometimes stepping on bodies, hearing bones crack under their boots. The distance closed. 200 yards, 150. You could see their faces clearly now. Expressions of fear, determination, rage, mouths open in shouts you couldn't hear over the noise of drums and arrows and screaming. Some men in your formation broke. The arrows were too much. They turned and tried to run, shoving past the ranks behind them. Sergeants caught most of them, physically dragging them back. beating them with spear butts, screaming in their faces until they stumbled back into position. One man who tried to run was cut down by a sergeant's sword. The message was clear. Forward might mean death, but backward definitely meant death. 100 yards now. The arrows slowed, then stopped. Too close now. Risk hitting your own side. The drums intensified. The shouting grew louder. Both lines were screaming now, thousands of voices merging into one continuous roar. It was meant to intimidate the enemy, but it also served to drown out your own thoughts, which was a mercy, because thinking would make you freeze. 80 yards, 70, 60. You could see individual details now. The rust on an enemy soldier's helmet, the tear in someone's tunic, the missing teeth in a screaming mouth. 50 yards. Your heart was going to explode out of your chest. You couldn't breathe. Your legs moved automatically, carrying you forward, even though every instinct screamed to run. 40 yards, 30. The front ranks lowered their spears, a wall of wooden shafts pointing forward, forming a bristling hedge of death. You weren't in the front, thank God, but you could see what was coming. 20 yards. Both sides were sprinting now, the walk breaking into a run. The lines accelerated toward each other, like waves rushing to collision. 15 yards. 10. You saw a man at the front stumble, fall. The men behind couldn't stop. They ran over him. His scream cut off as boots smashed into his face, his chest crushing him into the mud. 5 yards. The noise was beyond description. Screaming, drums, the thunder of thousands of feet hitting the ground simultaneously. 3 yards, 2, and then with a sound like the world breaking, the lines crashed together. The men ahead stopped suddenly as they crashed into the enemy, and you slammed into them from behind. Everyone behind you crashed into you. Suddenly, you were part of a massive human press, crushed between layers of bodies, unable to move, barely able to breathe. This was the reality of medieval melee combat. It wasn't Hollywood dueling. It wasn't one-on-one fights with room to maneuver. It was a shoving match where thousands of pounds of human weight pushed from both sides, and the men caught in the middle were crushed, stabbed, or trampled. The front rank was dying. You couldn't see it clearly, but you could hear it. Screams, wet thuds, the sound of metal on flesh, spears thrust over and over into the packed enemy formation. There was no room to dodge, no space to parry. You just took the hit, or you didn't. Men at the very front tried to use their weapons, but there was barely room to swing. A sword was almost useless here. Too long, too awkward. Short weapons were better. Daggers, axes, hammers. You could stab or crush at close range, brutal and efficient. But the real killer was the pressure. The weight of hundreds of men pushing from behind meant the men at the front couldn't retreat, even if they wanted to. They were pinned in place, crushed against the enemy line, unable to do anything but stab weakly forward and hope the enemy died before they did. Men suffocated in the press, literally crushed so tightly They couldn't expand their lungs to breathe. Their faces would turn red, then purple. They'd gasp like fish out of water, mouths opening and closing, getting no air. Then they'd die, still standing upright, held in place by the bodies around them, and nobody would even notice until the pressure eased and they fell. The ground became a nightmare within minutes. Blood mixed with mud, creating a slick paste, the color and consistency of liver. Bodies of the dead and wounded carpeted the earth, turning the battlefield into a treacherous landscape of corpses. You were walking on them, stepping on them, using them for footing, because the mud was too slippery otherwise. You'd step forward, and your boot would land on something soft, a stomach, a face, a hand. The body would shift under your weight, making you stumble. Sometimes the bodies underneath weren't dead. They'd grab at your legs, trying to pull themselves up or trying to pull you down with them in their death throes. You'd kick them away or step on their heads to maintain balance, because stopping meant falling, and falling in this press meant being trampled to death. Your weapon, whatever it was, became an extension of pure survival instinct. The man you'd stabbed might scream or gasp or make no sound at all if you'd hit something that killed instantly. Then the pressure of the crowd would push him away, and someone else would take his place. Sometimes you missed. Your blade would glance off a shield or piece of armor or thrust into empty air because the person you'd been aiming at had moved or fallen. And in that moment of overextension, with your spear extended and your body off balance, someone from the other side would strike at you. You felt impacts constantly, weapons hitting your shield if you had one, blades glancing off whatever protection you'd managed to scrape together. A spear point would catch your shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin, leaving a burning line of pain. A hammer blow to your side would crack a rib, the pain so intense you couldn't breathe for several seconds. An axe would catch the top of your poorly protected head, splitting skin and leaving you dazed and bleeding. Vision swimming, but adrenaline was a hell of a drug. The pain was there, but distant, muted by your body's desperate attempt to keep you alive and functioning. You'd feel the injury, register that you'd been hurt, but the full impact wouldn't hit until later, if there was a later. The noise was overwhelming beyond description, screaming from all sides, battle cries, death cries, cries of pain and terror, the clang of metal on metal as weapons struck shields and armor, the wet, meaty sounds of blades hitting flesh, the splintering of wooden shafts as spears broke under pressure, men crying for their mothers, for God, for anyone to help them. The sounds humans make when they're dying, sounds you'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again, but that would echo in your nightmares for the rest of your life. And through it all, the relentless pressure, push forward or be pushed back. There was no standing still. The battle line surged back and forth, feet at a time, as one side gained momentary advantage. and then lost it. You weren't fighting individual enemies. You were part of a mass, a human battering ram crashing against another human battering ram. Sometimes you'd see a face through the chaos, an enemy soldier, eyes wide with fear or rage, mouth open in a scream. Then he'd disappear in the press of bodies, and you'd never see him again. Dust and blood filled the air, kicked up by thousands of feet, mixed with the metallic taste of blood, creating a choking cloud that made it hard to breathe and impossible to see clearly. You'd blink constantly, trying to clear your vision, but the grit would get in your eyes anyway. Sweat poured down your face despite the cool air. Fear, sweat, effort, sweat, the body's desperate attempt to cool itself during the most intense physical experience of your life. Your mouth was parched, your throat raw from screaming orders or battle cries you didn't remember shouting. Time became meaningless. Were you fighting for minutes? Hours? Impossible to tell. Every second stretched into eternity. Every heartbeat a small miracle. The world narrowed to this moment, this press of bodies, this desperate struggle to stay alive one more second. And then somewhere in the chaos, something shifted. Medieval battles weren't won by killing every single enemy soldier. They were won when one side's morale shattered and the formation collapsed into panic. It could happen suddenly, like a dam bursting, or gradually, like water slowly undermining a foundation until everything gave way at once. The break, when it came, was unmistakable. You felt it before you saw it. A change in the pressure, a shift in the sounds around you. The relentless push forward would falter. The battle cries would turn into something else. Fear, desperation, then panic. It might start with a banner falling. The king's standard or a great lord's colors would go down, and men would think their leader was dead. Word would spread through the ranks faster than wildfire. The king is down. The king is dead. We're lost. Sometimes it was simpler. A section of the line would give ground just a few feet, but that movement would ripple outward. Men would look around and see their neighbors backing up, and they'd back up too. A fighting withdrawal would become a retreat. A retreat would become a rout, or it could be something as mundane as a rumor. The flank is broken, someone would shout, and even if it wasn't true, the fear would spread. Men would crane their necks, trying to see what was happening, and in that moment of distraction, the enemy would surge forward. When the break came, it was swift and terrible. Someone at the back would turn and run, then another, then 10, then 100. The formation would dissolve like salt in water, men throwing down their weapons and sprinting for their lives. This was the rout, and this was when the real killing began. You see, fighting an organized enemy who's facing you, shields up, weapons ready, that's hard, that's dangerous. You might die, but chasing down terrified men who've thrown away their weapons and are running in blind panic, that's easy, that's safe, that's sport. The cavalry, which had been waiting for exactly this moment, charged. War horses, trained to run down fleeing men, thundered across the field. Knights with lances lowered, caught runners in the back, the impact lifting men off their feet and hurling them aside like broken dolls. The sound of cavalry hitting a routing formation was distinctive. The drum of hooves building to thunder. Then the wet impacts as lances found flesh. The screaming of horses and men. The grinding sound of heavy riders trampling bodies into the mud. Foot soldiers pursuit on foot, chasing down anyone slower or more wounded. A man stumbling on an injured leg didn't make it far. Neither did anyone exhausted from the fight, which was everyone. The killing was methodical and one-sided. Catch a fleeing man, stab him in the back, move to the next one. No honor, no glory, just slaughter. The pursuers weren't taking prisoners among the common soldiers. Prisoners had to be fed, guarded, maintained. It was easier to kill them, and the field of battle transformed into an abattoir. Men died running. Some made it 100 yards before being caught. Some died within steps of where they'd been fighting. The ground became carpeted with bodies, and more were added every second. If you were on the winning side, you faced a choice: join the pursuit and maybe claim some plunder from the dead, or stay behind and start the grim work of looting the battlefield while the killing was still happening elsewhere. If you were on the losing side, you ran, and you prayed to every saint you could remember, because routing soldiers didn't run in formation. The bonds of fellowship that had held you together dissolved instantly. But if you looked like a peasant, like a common soldier with no value, mercy was unlikely. It was faster to kill you than to bother with capture. The pursuit could last for miles. Exhausted men running on pure terror, chased by mounted knights who treated it like a hunt. Some fleeing soldiers made it to woods or rivers, places where horses couldn't follow easily. They'd hide, praying the enemy gave up and went home. Many didn't make it that far. The casualty figures from medieval battles tell the story. A battle might last an hour or two, with relatively few deaths during the actual fighting, but the rout could last the rest of the day. And that's where the numbers exploded. Agincourt saw the French lose thousands of men, most during the rout. Towton, the bloodiest battle on English soil, reportedly killed 28,000, the majority cut down while fleeing through a snowstorm. Crécy left a field carpeted with French nobility and common soldiers alike. The survivors of a rout, if there were any, faced a new problem. They were alone in enemy territory, with no food, no weapons, and no idea where their army had gone, or if it even still existed. Getting home became a nightmare in itself. Let's say you survived the battle itself, the melee, the rout, the immediate slaughter. Congratulations. Now, let's talk about your wounds and why you probably wish you died quickly. Medieval combat left injuries that were horrifying, even by modern standards, and medieval medicine was, to put it charitably, inadequate. First, understand that in the chaos of melee, you didn't get clean wounds. You got hacked, stabbed, crushed, and mangled. Weapons didn't slice neatly through flesh. They tore it, shattered bone, and left ragged wounds that bled profusely. A sword cut to your arm wouldn't be a thin line like in movies. It would be a gaping wound, muscles severed, tendons cut, bone possibly fractured or split. The edges would be rough, torn, impossible to stitch together properly, even if you had proper surgeons, which you didn't. A spear thrust to your abdomen would puncture internal organs, your stomach, your intestines, your liver. The blade would carry dirt and fabric into the wound, contaminating everything it touched. Even if the spear missed vital organs, the internal bleeding and infection would probably kill you anyway. If you were a knight or noble, you had a chance. Your retainers would search for you among the bodies, recognize your armor or heraldry, and carry you to safety. A surgeon would be summoned. You might survive. If you were a common soldier, you lay where you fell. Maybe a friend would drag you to the edge of the field if you were lucky. Maybe not. You might lie there for hours, bleeding, watching the sun move across the sky, wondering if you were going to die alone. The camp followers descended on the battlefield like carrion birds. They moved among the wounded and dead, robbing them systematically. Weapons, armor, clothes, coins, anything of value was stripped from men too injured to resist. Some of these scavengers would kill the wounded to make looting easier. A knife to the throat was quick and practical. They weren't being especially cruel, just efficient. A dying man couldn't object to having his boots stolen. You'd lie there bleeding, watching someone rifle through your belongings while you were still wearing them. Maybe they'd leave you some dignity. Maybe they'd take everything, leaving you naked in the mud to die of exposure. If you protested, if you tried to stop them, they'd finish you off without hesitation. Eventually, if you were lucky, the army surgeons would arrive. But medieval surgeons were barely qualified by any reasonable standard. Their training consisted mainly of apprenticeship to other surgeons, learning by trial and error. There were no medical schools, no understanding of anatomy beyond what you could observe by cutting open bodies. The tools were primitive and terrifying. Bone saws for amputating limbs, cauterizing irons heated in campfires, crude forceps for pulling arrows out of flesh, all of it caked with blood and filth from previous patients because sterilization hadn't been invented yet. Arrow wounds were particularly problematic. If the arrow had gone completely through your body, the surgeon might push it the rest of the way out, tearing a larger exit wound. If it was stuck, they'd have to pull it back out, dragging the barbed head through flesh and muscle while you screamed. Either way, you got to experience the sensation of metal scraping against bone, of torn flesh separating, of your body being violated by crude medical instruments while you were fully conscious and feeling everything. Amputation was common. A mangled limb, especially if bone was shattered beyond repair, couldn't be saved. The surgeon would tie a leather tourniquet above the wound, place your arm or leg on a wooden block, and saw through bone and muscle as quickly as possible. You'd be held down by several men while this happened. No drugs, no alcohol, strong enough to dull the pain significantly. You'd feel the saw teeth biting into your bone, the vibration traveling up through your body, the wet tearing its flesh separated. The pain was beyond human description. Men would pass out from shock, which was a mercy. Those who stayed conscious would scream until their voices gave out, then continue screaming silently, mouth open, no sound emerging. When the limb was severed, the stump would be cauterized with a red-hot iron to seal the blood vessels. The smell of your own flesh cooking would fill your nostrils. The searing pain of the hot metal would somehow be worse than the amputation itself. If you survived the surgery, and many didn't, you still had to survive the aftermath. Every battlefield wound was contaminated. The weapons that caused them were filthy, covered in rust, dirt, and the blood of previous victims. The ground you'd been lying on was full of bacteria from human and animal waste. The surgeon's unwashed hands introduced more contamination. Within hours or days, infection would set in. The wound would become red, swollen, hot to the touch. Pus would form, thick and foul-smelling. Streaks of red would appear on your skin as the infection spread through your lymphatic system. Gangrene was the worst. The flesh around your wound would turn black, then green, then fall away in rotting chunks. The smell was indescribable, sweet, putrid, the unmistakable scent of death while you were still alive. The gangrene would spread. First, the immediate area around the wound, then outward, consuming healthy tissue. You'd watch your own body rot while you were still using it. Medieval doctors had treatments for infection, and they were all useless. They'd pack wounds with honey, which actually had mild antimicrobial properties, but nothing close to what was needed. They'd apply poultices of various herbs, comfrey, plantain, woundwort, based on folklore and superstition. They'd bleed you to balance your humors, removing blood you couldn't spare. They'd pray over you, which might have provided psychological comfort, but did nothing for bacterial infections. None of it worked against serious infections. The gangrene would continue spreading until it reached vital areas or entered your bloodstream. Sepsis would set in, your body's immune system going into overdrive, causing high fever, delirium, organ failure. Death from infection was slow and agonizing, taking days or weeks as you lay in increasing agony, your wound stinking your body, consuming itself, while everyone around you knew you were doomed and could do nothing but wait for you to die. Some men begged to be killed, to be put out of their misery like wounded animals. Sometimes friends obliged with a quiet mercy killing, when no one was watching, using a pillow over the face, a knife between the ribs, or anything to end the suffering. Internal injuries were often worse than external ones. If you'd been stabbed in the abdomen, your intestines might be perforated, allowing gut bacteria to leak into your abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis, an infection of the membrane lining your abdominal cavity. This was essentially a death sentence, but a slow one, as your abdomen would swell with fluid and infection, and the pain would be constant, sharp, and getting worse over days, leading to a fever, confusion, and eventually shock, as your organs shut down one by one. Head wounds often resulted in brain damage. Even if you survived, a skull fracture could cause bleeding inside your head, putting pressure on your brain. And while you might seem fine initially, you could deteriorate rapidly as the pressure built, or survive with permanent damage, like loss of speech, paralysis, seizures, or personality changes so severe that your family wouldn't recognize the person you'd become, forcing you to go home as a living ghost. A burden on relatives who couldn't afford to care for an invalid. Even minor wounds could kill you in the medieval period. A cut on your hand that got infected, a bruised rib that punctured your lung weeks later, or a sprained ankle that became gangrenous after you walked on it through contaminated mud. The infection rates were staggering, with modern estimates suggesting that the majority of wounded soldiers who survived the initial injury died later from complications. So, what would be treatable conditions today? Broken bones, cuts requiring stitches, puncture wounds were often fatal in medieval times. Pain management was primitive, as the strongest painkillers available were alcohol and opium when you could get them, meaning most wounded soldiers endured their injuries with nothing but prayers and gritted teeth. Chronic pain was a constant companion. Bones that healed poorly left you with permanent aches. Scar tissue would restrict movement, and nerve damage would cause shooting pains or complete numbness. And when you finally healed enough to travel, you faced the challenge of getting home while disabled, alone, and broke. After the battle ended, after the rout was complete, after the wounded had been sorted into might live and definitely dying, the real business began: looting. Medieval soldiers weren't paid well, and many weren't paid at all, beyond basic provisions that were often inadequate. So the promise of plunder was one of the primary reasons men agreed to fight. And the battlefield, now carpeted with thousands of dead bodies, represented the largest concentration of portable wealth most soldiers would ever see. It started while the battle was still technically happening, as even during the pursuit of routing enemies, soldiers would stop chasing to rob nearby corpses, wondering why chase a fleeing peasant when there were bodies right here with weapons armor and possibly coins. The looting was systematic and thorough. Professional scavengers, camp followers who made their living this way, moved across the battlefield with practiced efficiency, stripping bodies in minutes. First came the obvious valuables, weapons, if they were decent quality, since a good sword could be sold for more money than a peasant saw in a year. And even damaged weapons had value, as metal could be reforged, repaired, and sold to armorers who would fix them and resell them. Armor was incredibly valuable. A mail hauberk, even if punctured or torn, was worth a fortune. And plate pieces, helmets, and shields would all be carefully removed and sorted with even crude leather armor worth taking, if your own gear was worse. The bodies were searched methodically. Clothes first, as anything better than what you were wearing got taken, and boots were especially prized, since most soldiers had terrible footwear that was falling apart. So, a dead man's boots, even if they were blood-soaked, represented a significant upgrade. Then came the personal search. Purses, hidden pockets, jewelry. Medieval soldiers often carried their savings with them because banks didn't exist, and leaving money at home meant it would be stolen or confiscated. So a single soldier might have months of wages hidden on his body. Rings were pried off fingers, and if a ring wouldn't come off because of swelling, the finger was cut off, as it was faster and more efficient than trying to work the ring loose. Necklaces were torn from necks. Earrings, if the dead man wore them, were ripped free, sometimes taking pieces of ear along. Teeth were checked for gold fillings or gold caps, which were rare among common soldiers, but worth looking for, and gold teeth would be extracted with pliers or knocked out with hammer blows. The search was invasive and thorough. Clothing was cut open to check for hidden pockets. Boots were pulled off and examined for coins hidden in the soles, and bodies were rolled over to check underneath for anything that might have fallen out. Some soldiers hid emergency money in their mouths, under their tongues, so bodies would have their mouths pried open and searched. Others hid coins in their rectums, and the most desperate scavengers would check there too. The nobles and knights were the real prizes, since their equipment was custom made, worth a fortune. A knight's sword might be worth more than a village's annual tax revenue, and his armor could cost as much as a castle's monthly operating expenses. But even common soldiers were worth robbing. That peasant you'd been standing next to, the one who died with a spear through his chest, his shoes were probably better than yours. His knife was sharper, and his belt was in better condition. This was the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, where sentiment was a luxury you couldn't afford. The dead had no use for their possessions, and the living needed everything they could get to survive. And yes, you'd loot your own side's dead, your comrades, your friends, men from your own village, the man who'd shared his bread with you during the march, who'd stood beside you in the battle line, who died bravely fighting the enemy. You'd rob his corpse without hesitation. It wasn't personal, it was practical. He was dead, you were alive, and his family would never know what happened to his belongings anyway, so better that you take them than let enemy soldiers or random scavengers profit. The camp followers worked faster and more efficiently than the soldiers because this was their profession. They'd move across the battlefield in organized teams, stripping bodies with assembly line precision, as one person would cut the body free of its clothing, another would search the clothes for hidden valuables, and a third would remove armor and weapons, with everything sorted into piles based on value and portability. Sometimes, the wounded were robbed while still alive. You'd lie there bleeding, unable to move, and watch as someone systematically stole everything you owned: your weapon, your armor, your shoes, the few coins you'd managed to save. If you protested, if you tried to stop them, they'd kill you, as it was easier than arguing, and you were probably going to die anyway from your wounds, so they were just speeding up the process. The most valuable items would be claimed immediately by whoever found them, while lesser valuables would be gathered into communal piles to be divided later among the victorious army, which led to disputes, fights, and sometimes killings over who had the right to specific pieces of loot. Soldiers would hide their best finds, burying valuable items or concealing them in their equipment. Trust was non-existent, and your fellow soldiers would rob you just as quickly as they'd rob the enemy dead if they thought you had something valuable. The bodies themselves, once stripped naked, were left to rot. Thousands of corpses, pale and bloody, scattered across the field like a grotesque harvest. The smell was beyond description: sweet, putrid, thick enough to taste, and flies swarmed in clouds so dense they looked like smoke. The corpses created a massive public health hazard. Disease spread from the rotting flesh, and the water supply downstream became contaminated, so locals who lived near battlefields would often suffer outbreaks of plague cholera or other diseases in the weeks following a major battle. Eventually, someone would have to deal with the bodies. Sometimes mass graves were dug and the corpses buried in piles, but more often the bodies were just left to decompose where they fell. and nature would take its course. Scavenger animals, insects, weather, and within a few months, only bones would remain. Local peasants would sometimes bury the dead, partly from Christian charity, but mostly because rotting corpses made their land unusable. But burial was expensive. Labor-intensive work, so many battlefield dead were never properly interred, and years later, farmers would plow up bones and rusted weapons. Metal detectors today still find artifacts from medieval battles, corroded swords, arrow points, pieces of armor that survived in the soil long after the men who wore them had become dust. The commanders, meanwhile, were dividing up the really valuable prisoners. Knights and nobles captured during the battle were worth enormous ransoms, so these men were treated well housed, comfortably, and eventually returned to their families in exchange for payment that could fund entire military campaigns. Common soldiers who'd been captured faced different treatment. If they had any value as laborers, they might be kept as slaves or servants, but if not, they were often killed outright because feeding prisoners was expensive and nobody wanted to waste resources on worthless captives. This was the aftermath of medieval warfare. Not glorious, not honorable, just efficient, brutal scavenging. The dead were stripped of everything valuable, their bodies left to feed crows and rats, and life moved on. The survivors now had to carry their plunder, protect it from being stolen by their own side, and somehow get it home without being robbed by bandits, fellow soldiers, or corrupt officials. Because while the battle was over, the war was never really finished. The battle was won or lost. Either way, the army was disbanding, and you were expected to find your own way home. For the knights and nobles, this was straightforward. They had horses, retinue, money for inns and food, and they'd ride home in relative comfort, their war stories already being polished for future tellings. For you, the common soldier, getting home was another ordeal that might kill you after you'd somehow survived everything else. First, you had to figure out where you were, as medieval soldiers often had only the vaguest idea of geography beyond their immediate local area. You'd been marched for weeks through unfamiliar territory, fought a battle somewhere that might not even have a proper name, and now you were expected to navigate hundreds of miles back to your village. Some armies stayed together for the initial part of the journey, marching toward friendly territory before disbanding, which offered protection from bandits and hostile locals. But once you reached the border of your home region, you were on your own. The wounds you'd taken in battle were still with you. That cut on your arm from a sword blade still infected red and swollen weeping pus that stained your clothes, and that blow to the ribs from a warhammer, probably a fracture that sent shooting pains through your chest. Every time you breathed deeply, you were traveling while injured, with no medical care, through territory that ranged from indifferent to actively hostile. Every step was painful, and every mile was an achievement. Food was scarce. The army's supply system, such as it was, no longer existed, so you had to forage, beg, or steal food to survive. Foraging meant eating whatever you could find: berries, nuts, roots, grass if you were desperate enough, and most of it was inadequate nutrition for a man trying to walk 20 miles a day. Begging meant approaching villages and farms asking for charity. Sometimes it worked, as Christian duty demanded feeding the hungry, and some people took that seriously. But most villagers had been raided and robbed by soldiers so many times that they viewed any armed man as a threat. Stealing was risky, but sometimes necessary. You could take food from fields or orchards, but if you were caught, local justice was swift and brutal, with peasants beating thieves to death with farming tools or handing them over to local authorities who would hang them without trial. Your plunder, if you'd managed to acquire any, made you a target. Other soldiers, your former comrades, would rob you if they thought you had something valuable. As the bonds of fellowship that had existed during the campaign dissolved the moment the army disbanded, and you couldn't trust anyone, that man from the next village over who'd fought beside you in the shield wall, he'd cut your throat for a decent sword or a purse of coins, as survival made everyone desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Bandits watched the roads specifically for disbanded soldiers. They knew veterans would be carrying weapons, armor, possibly loot from the battlefield, and groups of brigands would ambush individual soldiers or small groups, killing them and taking everything. The smart approach was to travel in larger groups, but large groups moved slowly and attracted attention. Small groups moved faster, but were vulnerable to attack. Traveling alone was fastest, but essentially suicidal. You had to sleep rough every night. Inns existed, but they were expensive, and often wouldn't accept common soldiers anyway, as innkeepers had learned that soldiers meant trouble, fighting, drinking, inability to pay theft. So most would turn you away at the door, forcing you to sleep wherever you could find shelter. Under trees, in abandoned buildings, in ditches, if necessary. Every night was a gamble that you wouldn't be murdered in your sleep by fellow travelers, bandits, or local villagers who didn't want soldiers in their area. The weather was a constant enemy. Rain soaked through your inadequate clothing, leaving you shivering, and miserable cold at night penetrated to your bones because you had no proper bedding. And heat during the day was exhausting when you were already weakened by injuries and poor nutrition. Your clothes, already worn and damaged from the campaign, continued deteriorating. The same tunic you'd worn for months was now torn, stained with blood and mud, and falling apart at the seams, and your shoes, if you still had them, were held together with strips of cloth and determination. Disease was still killing men on the journey home. The dysentery that had plagued the army during the campaign continued affecting survivors. Infected wounds got worse without treatment, and respiratory infections spread among groups of travelers sleeping in close quarters. Some men didn't make it. They'd collapse by the roadside, too exhausted or sick to continue, and fellow travelers would check if they had anything worth taking, then leave them to die alone. It was harsh, but practical, as you couldn't carry a dying man hundreds of miles. Villages you passed through were hostile or fearful. Local peasants had been dealing with soldiers for months or years, with armies marching through, taking food, conscripting men, and fighting battles that destroyed crops and buildings. So they were tired of war, and everyone associated with it. Some villages would leave food at the outskirts to encourage soldiers to move on without entering. Others would send armed men to escort soldiers through their territory as quickly as possible, and a few would attack stragglers outright, especially if the group was small enough to overwhelm. River crossings were particularly dangerous. Bridges were rare and often guarded by locals who charged tolls or simply refused passage to soldiers. Fording meant getting soaked, which could lead to illness or hypothermia. Swimming meant risking drowning, especially if you were wounded or carrying equipment. Some entrepreneurs set up ferry services specifically to take advantage of returning soldiers, charging exorbitant rates for passage, while others were bandits in disguise, taking your money and then robbing you on the far side. The journey home could take weeks or months, depending on how far the campaign had taken you and how well you could travel with your injuries. Every day was a struggle to find food, avoid danger, and keep moving despite pain and exhaustion. Some soldiers joined together for protection, forming small bands of men heading in the same general direction. But these groups were fragile alliances, as trust was limited, resources were scarce, and arguments over food, direction, or loot distribution could lead to violence. Your family relationships never fully recovered. Your wife tried to understand, but how could she? She'd been home worrying and working and raising children, while you'd been in hell, and the distance between your experiences was unbridgeable. She'd try to comfort you during nightmares, and you'd push her away, because in that moment, in the confusion between sleep and waking, you were back in the battle, and anyone touching you was an enemy to be fought. You'd snap at her over trivial things, meals that weren't ready on time, children making too much noise, visitors who stayed too long, and she'd forgive you because she understood you'd been through something terrible. But the constant tension wore on both of you. Some marriages ended, others became cold, functional arrangements where husband and wife lived like polite strangers, sharing a house, but not a life, as the emotional intimacy that had existed before the war was gone, replaced by careful distance and unspoken resentment. Your children feared you. The father who'd left was a familiar figure, perhaps strict, but predictable and safe, while the man who'd returned was different, moody, violent, prone to sudden rages over nothing. They'd learned to be quiet around you, to avoid setting off your temper. When they looked at you, you could see the fear in their eyes. Not just fear of punishment, but a deeper fear, the recognition that their father had become someone dangerous, unpredictable, and damaged beyond repair. The guilt was overwhelming. You'd survived when so many others had died. Men better than you, braver than you, more deserving of life, had been killed while you'd somehow lived. The randomness of it was maddening. Why had the arrow hit the man next to you instead of you? Why had you stumbled at just the right moment to avoid a sword stroke that would have killed you? Why had your friend died slowly and painfully while you walked away with minor wounds? Survivor's guilt ate at you constantly. You'd see the families of men who died in the battle, and you couldn't look them in the eye. Their husbands, fathers, sons were dead, and you were alive. There was no justice in it, no divine plan you could understand. You'd killed enemy soldiers, men who probably had families too, and their faces haunted your dreams. You'd wonder about their children, their wives, whether anyone mourned for them, even though the killing had been necessary, justified, and a part of war. But that didn't make it easier to live with. The village priest tried to help, hearing your confession, absolving your sins, and reminding you that you'd fought in a just war, where killing in battle wasn't murder in God's eyes. But theological forgiveness couldn't erase the memories or quiet the guilt. Years would pass. The immediate trauma would fade slightly, though never completely. You'd learn to manage the nightmares, to control the anger, and to function in civilian life despite everything you'd been through. You'd find work that accommodated your injuries, develop coping strategies for the bad days, and rebuild relationships with your family, though they'd never be the same as before the war. You would never be the same man who'd left the village that day when the bailiff came calling. That person was gone, left behind on a battlefield, whose name you might not even remember clearly. Medieval veterans carried their wars with them forever. They'd die decades later, old men who'd never truly escaped the battle, still fighting enemies in their dreams, still hearing the sounds of men dying, still wondering why they'd survived when so many others hadn't. And when they died, maybe then they'd finally find peace. Or maybe not. The chronicles and histories written about medieval battles focus on the great men, kings and nobles, the knights who performed heroic deeds, the strategic brilliance of commanders. They talk about honor and glory, about divine favor and righteous causes, about the rise and fall of dynasties. They don't talk about you. The historical record is almost silent on what common soldiers experienced. Their stories weren't written down because they didn't matter to the chroniclers who composed the official accounts. You weren't important enough to remember individually. You were just numbers, casualties, losses, acceptable sacrifices in someone else's political calculations. But collectively, the cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Every medieval battle killed thousands of common soldiers, not just in the fighting itself, but in the diseases that swept through armies and the famines that followed military campaigns, leading to economic devastation that destroyed entire regions for generations. The 100 Years' War, spanning over a century, killed hundreds of thousands of people. The vast majority were peasants, soldiers, conscripted from their villages, civilians caught in the path of marching armies, and families who starved when their breadwinners were killed or crippled. The Wars of the Roses devastated England's population, particularly the nobility, but the common soldiers who filled out the battle lines paid an equally heavy price. Towton alone may have killed 28,000 men in a single day, most of them farmers and laborers who'd never wanted to fight. The Crusades turned the eastern Mediterranean into a graveyard. Entire armies died of disease before reaching the Holy Land, and those who survived the journey often died in futile assaults on fortified cities. The Children's Crusade saw thousands of young people sold into slavery or killed outright, all in the name of God. And for what? Most medieval wars were fought over territorial disputes between nobles, succession crises, or abstract concepts of honor that meant nothing to the men doing the dying. You didn't fight for freedom or justice. You fought because you were told to, and you died because someone else's ambition demanded bodies to fill graves. The economic impact of medieval warfare on peasant communities was catastrophic and long-lasting. Every man conscripted was a man not working the fields during crucial planting or harvest seasons, and entire regions would suffer crop failures because too many workers had been taken for military service. Families left behind struggled to maintain farms and workshops, forcing women and children to do work previously done by adult men, often unsuccessfully. Harvests failed, livestock died from neglect, and debt accumulated as families borrowed money to survive, often losing their land when they couldn't repay. The soldiers who did return were often too damaged to work effectively. A man missing a hand couldn't operate many farming or crafting tools. Someone with a severe limp couldn't keep up with the physical demands of agricultural labor, and veterans with head injuries might be unable to perform any complex tasks. These men became economic burdens on families that were already struggling. Instead of contributing to household income, they required care and support they often couldn't reciprocate. The emotional and financial strain destroyed countless families across medieval Europe. The social fabric of medieval society was built on these sacrifices, but the sacrifices were never voluntary and rarely honored. The feudal system demanded that peasants give their labor, their resources, and their lives to their lords, supposedly in return for protection, but in reality, they received exploitation. Lords used their military obligations to extract wealth and labor from peasants, and the threat of conscription became a tool of social control. Resist the Lord's demands, and you might find yourself in the front rank of the next battle. The psychological toll on medieval society is impossible to calculate accurately, but the evidence suggests it was massive. How many veterans returned home violent, broken, unable to function as husbands and fathers? How many families were destroyed by men who'd seen too much, done too much, suffered too much? How many children grew up fatherless, or with fathers who couldn't be fathers anymore? How many women became widows, or were forced to care for permanently disabled husbands? How many communities lost their most productive members to wars they had no voice in starting? Medieval people understood this cost better than we might expect. There's a reason common folk weren't enthusiastic about war, despite the cultural glorification of military valor. There's a reason desertion was so common that draconian punishments were needed to prevent it. There's a reason peace treaties were often welcomed by everyone, except the nobility who profited from conflict. They knew what we've forgotten in our romanticization of medieval warfare, that battles were hell, that soldiers were victims as much as participants, and that the glory and honor existed only in stories told by people who'd never stood in a shield wall watching their friends die. The long-term consequences rippled through generations. Veterans' children often grew up in poverty because their fathers couldn't work. They might inherit not land or wealth, but debt and social stigma. The sons of veterans were sometimes conscripted earlier or more frequently because officials assumed military service was a family tradition. Entire regions could be depopulated by warfare. Areas that saw repeated campaigns. The borderlands between England and Scotland, the contested territories of France during the 100 Years' War, experienced cycles of destruction that prevented normal economic development. Villages would be burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Families would flee, return, and flee again. Agricultural systems that had taken generations to develop would be destroyed in days and take decades to restore. The technological and cultural development that might have occurred in peacetime was stunted by the constant diversion of resources to warfare. As you got closer to home, you started to realize something that no one had prepared you for. You didn't want to go back. The closer you got to your village, the more anxious you became. Home represented a life you'd left behind, a person you'd been before. The war changed you fundamentally. The man who'd left your village months ago was gone. In his place was someone harder, scarred, carrying memories and experiences that couldn't be shared with people who'd never left their fields. You'd seen things, done things, survived things that were beyond the comprehension of anyone who'd stayed home. How do you explain what a battlefield smells like? How do you describe the sound of a man dying? How do you tell your wife about the nightmares that wake you screaming? The war had changed you in ways you didn't fully understand yet, and as you approached the familiar boundaries of your home, you wondered if there was still a place for you there. You'd survived against every conceivable odd through battle, disease, injury, and the nightmare journey home. You'd made it back to your village. You could see the familiar fields, the houses you'd known since childhood, the church where you'd been baptized, and everything was wrong. Your family, if they'd survived in your absence, barely recognized you. You'd left as a relatively healthy man, probably overweight by medieval standards, which meant you had enough to eat most of the time. But you returned gaunt, hollow-cheeked, your clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost $30 or $40 lobby. Scars marked your body. The sword cut on your arm had healed badly, leaving a puckered line of scar tissue. The mace blow to your head had left a dent in your skull that you could feel with your fingers, and you walked with a limp from the spear wound in your leg that had never properly healed. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what had happened inside your head. Your wife embraced you, crying with relief and joy. Your children stared at you like you were a stranger, which in many ways you were. Your parents, if they were still alive, asked questions about the campaign, and you couldn't answer, because how do you explain what you'd seen? How do you tell your wife about watching your friend die slowly from a gut wound, begging for someone to end his suffering? How do you explain to your children why you wake up screaming in the middle of the night? How do you describe the smell of a battlefield to people who think the worst odor they'll encounter is the pigsty? The village hadn't changed. The same houses, the same fields, the same petty gossip about who was sleeping with whom and which family had the best harvest. The problems that had seemed important when you left, boundary disputes, unpaid debts, social rivalries, now felt meaningless. You'd watched thousands of men die for causes they didn't understand. You'd survived battles that would be talked about for generations. You'd seen the worst and best of human nature, usually in the same day. And now people wanted to discuss whether the miller was charging fair prices for grain. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be named for centuries, but medieval soldiers absolutely suffered from it, with symptoms identical to what modern veterans experience, but without any understanding of what was happening or any effective treatment. You couldn't sleep without nightmares. The battle would replay in your mind with vivid clarity. You'd relive the moment when the lines crashed together, the sounds of men dying, the feeling of your spear punching through human flesh, and you'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, sometimes screaming. Loud noises would send you into panic. A door slamming sounded like shields clashing thunder, reminded you of cavalry charges and the sound of metal on metal. A blacksmith working someone sharpening a blade would make you flinch and reach for weapons you no longer carried. You developed hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats that didn't exist. In crowds, you'd position yourself where you could see all the exits. You'd sit with your back to walls, and you'd wake up multiple times each night, listening for sounds that might indicate danger. Your temper had changed. Little things would enrage you. A spilled drink, a crying child, someone walking too close behind you. You'd been living with constant threat for so long that normal life felt wrong, unsafe, and you'd lash out at your family unable to explain why you were so angry all the time. The work you'd done before the war, farming, carpentry, whatever trade you'd practiced, was either impossible or unbearable. If you'd lost fingers or a hand, physical labor was out of the question. Even if you were physically intact, you found it hard to care about anything. Planting crops seemed pointless when you'd seen entire armies die for nothing. Building furniture felt trivial after surviving battles that decided the fate of kingdoms, and the long-term thinking required for agriculture, planning next year's harvest, maintaining tools, caring for livestock, was beyond you when you were still struggling to get through each day. Your relationship with God had changed. You'd prayed desperately for survival, made bargains with saints, watched priests promise that God favored your cause, while identical priests on the other side made identical promises to your enemies. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Some veterans became more religious, interpreting their survival as divine intervention. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with the horrors they'd witnessed, and most fell somewhere in between, still believing, but with a faith that was harder, more complicated, shot through with doubt. Drinking helped when you could afford it. Alcohol could numb the memories, quiet the nightmares, and make the world seem bearable for a few hours. Many veterans became heavy drinkers, spending whatever money they had on ale or wine, trying to forget what couldn't be forgotten. Villages had their share of former soldiers who spent their days drunk in taverns, telling war stories to anyone who would listen. These men became familiar figures, scarred, limping, haunted, always ready to describe battles that grew more heroic with each telling. But even drunk, the memories remained. Alcohol might postpone the nightmares, but it couldn't erase them. The physical injuries were permanent reminders of what you'd endured. That limp from your leg wound wasn't going away. The chronic pain from ribs that had never set properly was your constant companion, and the missing fingers made every task more difficult. Medieval medicine had nothing to offer for chronic pain. Relief was limited to alcohol, prayers, and endurance. Physical therapy didn't exist, so you just learned to live with the damage, adapting as best you could. The community treated you differently now. You were marked, changed, no longer quite one of them. Parents didn't want their children playing too close to your house. Women avoided making eye contact, and even the church seemed uncomfortable with you, as if the violence you'd participated in, however justified, had stained your soul. People were afraid of veterans, and for good reason. You'd been trained to kill. You'd done it, and that knowledge was written in your posture, your eyes, the way you moved through the world. As civilians could sense the potential for violence, even when you tried to hide it. Some villages had multiple veterans, men who'd served in the same campaign or different wars, and you'd gravitate toward each other, the only people who understood what you'd been through. You'd gather in taverns or fields drinking and talking about things no one else could comprehend. These weren't pleasant gatherings. They were groups of damaged men, sharing space with other damaged men, trying to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. Sometimes the conversations helped. More often they made things worse, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. The economic impact was severe. If you couldn't work because of injury, your family suffered, as there were no disability benefits, no veterans payments, no government support of any kind. The Lord who'd conscripted you didn't care that you'd sacrificed your body for his war. You were home now. That was payment enough. Some veterans became beggars, displaying their war wounds to earn sympathy and coins. Town squares and church steps filled with maimed soldiers, one-legged men on crutches, blind men who'd lost their eyes to arrows, armless men who'd survived battlefield amputations. They'd tell their stories to anyone who'd listen, hoping for charity. Lost my hand at Agincourt, fighting for the king, spare a penny for an old soldier. The stories were usually true, though they grew more elaborate over time. Others turned to crime. The skills you'd learned during the war were transferable. You knew how to kill efficiently, how to intimidate people, how to take what you needed by force. Banditry attracted veterans who had nothing left to lose and no other way to survive. The roads of medieval Europe were dangerous, partly because of veteran soldiers who'd become outlaws. They knew tactics, weapons, and how to plan ambushes, and they were more dangerous than ordinary criminals because they'd been professionally trained in violence. Instead of building schools, hospitals, or infrastructure that would benefit everyone, medieval societies poured their wealth into weapons, fortifications, and armies. How many innovations were never developed because potential inventors died in battles? How many works of art were never created because artists were conscripted or killed? How many communities never reached their potential because their human capital was sacrificed to noble ambitions? The monuments and memorials that did exist honored the nobles almost exclusively. Knights had elaborate tombs with carved effigies, showing them in armor, hands folded in prayer, surrounded by heraldic symbols proclaiming their valor. Cathedrals displayed banners captured in battle, commemorating victories won by aristocratic commanders. The common soldiers were buried in mass graves, unmarked and forgotten. No one commissioned sculptures of peasant spearmen. No stained glass windows depicted farmers dying for their lords. The artistic legacy of medieval warfare ignored the majority of participants entirely. When songs were composed about battles, they celebrated the deeds of heroes, kings, princes, famous knights whose names would be remembered for centuries. The ballads spoke of honor, courage, and divine favor. They didn't mention the smell of the battlefield, the cries of wounded men, or the widows left behind. This selective memory wasn't accidental. It served the interests of the ruling class to portray warfare as glorious and noble. If people understood the true cost, if they saw past the romanticized versions to the brutal reality, they might be less willing to participate in future conflicts. So, the real history was suppressed, forgotten, or ignored. The stories that survived were the ones that served power, not truth. Even today, our popular culture perpetuates these myths. Movies, television shows, books, and games present medieval warfare as exciting, heroic, and meaningful. The protagonists are always nobles or exceptional individuals, and the common soldiers are background characters, faceless extras who exist only to make the heroes look good. We see the armor and weapons as impressive rather than inadequate. We focus on individual combat rather than mass slaughter. We emphasize the honor and glory while ignoring the disease, starvation, and terror that defined most soldiers' experiences. This romanticization does a disservice to everyone who suffered through the reality of medieval warfare. It reduces their experiences to entertainment, their sacrifices to plot devices, their trauma to background noise. The fact that we don't remember this, that our popular culture has turned medieval warfare into adventure stories, is perhaps the final insult to everyone who suffered through it. They died in agony so that we could enjoy fantasy versions of their misery. But we can choose to remember differently. We can honor their experiences by understanding what really happened, not the sanitized versions created for our comfort. We can acknowledge that the past wasn't more noble or heroic than the present. It was just more brutal and more honest about its brutality. So there it is. What actually happened in a medieval battle? From the moment some lord's bailiff knocked on your door to drag you from your fields through the nightmare of campaign life to the horror of combat itself, and finally to the long, painful aftermath that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit our fantasies about the past. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't honorable, it wasn't romantic or exciting or any of the things Hollywood has convinced us medieval warfare was like. It was terrifying, painful, disgusting, and traumatic in ways that would break most modern people within days. You did not die heroically in single combat with a worthy opponent while stirring music played in the background. You died crushed in oppressive bodies, stabbed from behind by someone you never saw, or you survived the battle only to die days later from an infected wound while lying in your own filth. You didn't fight for noble causes or grand ideals. You fought because refusing meant death, and even accepting meant probable death. But at least the social pressure made the choice feel inevitable. You stood in line with other terrified men, most of whom you didn't know and couldn't communicate with, waiting for the enemy to crash into you like a human avalanche. If you somehow survived the actual fighting, you weren't rewarded with honor, glory, or recognition. You were sent home with wounds that would never heal properly, memories that would poison your sleep for the rest of your life, and a community that would never fully understand or accept what you'd become. The reality of medieval warfare was that common soldiers were expendable resources in conflicts that didn't concern them. They were human ammunition fired at enemy formations and considered acceptable losses by commanders who never risked their own lives in the front ranks. You weren't a hero in some grand narrative. You were a victim of a social system that treated human life as cheap and disposable, especially if that life belonged to someone poor, uneducated, and powerless. And yet somehow, they did it. Thousands upon thousands of medieval soldiers, conscripted against their will, marched to battlefields across Europe and beyond. They fought because the alternatives were worse. They survived when they could, died when they couldn't, and left behind almost nothing except the occasional bone fragment discovered by archaeologists centuries later. Their courage wasn't the courage of stories, the brave knight facing down overwhelming odds to save the kingdom. It was something more fundamental and more tragic, the courage to keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when you knew where the road led, the courage to stand in formation and wait for enemies to try to kill you, because running meant certain death from your own side, the courage to keep living after experiencing things that should have broken any reasonable person. This was real courage, not the flashy, dramatic kind that makes for good entertainment, but the quiet, desperate kind that lets people endure the unendurable because they have no choice. Their suffering wasn't meaningful in any cosmic sense. They didn't die to make the world better, or to advance civilization, or to protect future generations. They died because powerful men wanted things: territory, wealth, prestige, and were willing to spend other people's lives to get them. But their suffering was real, and it deserves to be remembered accurately, not romanticized, not sanitized, not turned into entertainment, but acknowledged for what it was: the price ordinary people paid for extraordinary cruelty disguised as politics. We owe it to those forgotten soldiers to remember the truth, not because it makes us feel good, but because forgetting dishonors their memory. They deserve better than being reduced to background extras in someone else's adventure story. The next time you watch a medieval battle scene in a movie, or read about glorious warfare in a historical novel, remember this: every person in that scene represents someone real who experienced something far worse than any filmmaker would dare to show. Someone with a family, dreams and fears. Someone who probably didn't want to be there, and who paid a terrible price for being forced to participate in someone else's war. That's the real history. That's what actually happened in a medieval battle. War isn't an adventure. It's not romantic. It's not a solution to political problems. It's a catastrophe that destroys lives, breaks families, and leaves scars that last for generations. Medieval warfare was just more honest about being catastrophic because they did not have the technology or the propaganda apparatus to pretend otherwise. Every era's warfare, no matter how it's portrayed later by people who didn't experience it, is hell for the people who have to live through it. The weapons change, the tactics evolve, the uniforms get better, but the fundamental experience, terror, pain, loss, trauma, remains constant. Medieval soldiers weren't different from modern veterans in their psychological responses to combat. They just lived in a world that had no vocabulary for post-traumatic stress, no understanding of what we now call moral injury, and no systems for helping people recover from experiences that damaged the human psyche. They suffered alone in silence, carrying their wars inside them until they died. We can at least remember them accurately, honor their experiences by understanding what they went through, and perhaps learn something about the true cost of political violence. So, here's to the forgotten soldiers of medieval Europe, the peasants who never wanted to fight, the farm boys who died far from home, the men who survived but were never the same. They're not heroes in any traditional sense. They're something more important. They're human beings who endured inhuman experiences and somehow found ways to keep going. Their stories matter. Their suffering was real, and their memory deserves better than Hollywood fantasies about honor and glory. Remember them as they were: afraid, ordinary people, doing extraordinary things, not by choice, but because they had no choice. Remember the price they paid, so that we might understand what war actually costs. And maybe, if we remember them clearly enough, we'll be less eager to send other people's children to fight other people's wars. Thanks for sticking with this journey through one of history's darkest and most misunderstood realities. If you made it all the way through this exploration of what medieval warfare was actually like, you now know something that most people don't: the truth behind the legends. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't inspiring. It certainly wasn't the romantic adventure that popular culture has sold us for decades, but it was real, and the people who lived through it deserved to have their experiences remembered accurately not transformed into entertainment that ignores their suffering. The next time someone talks about the glory of medieval warfare, or suggests that people in the past were somehow tougher or more heroic than we are, you'll know better. They weren't tougher. They just had fewer choices and worse medical care. Medieval soldiers were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, most of them against their will. They did what they had to do to survive, and many of them didn't survive despite their best efforts. The ones who did make it home often carried the war with them for the rest of their lives in ways that their communities couldn't understand or accommodate. We have covered a lot of ground tonight, from the moment of conscription through the march to battle, the fighting itself, the aftermath, and the long journey home to a life that could never be the same. Each stage was its own particular kind of hell, and most soldiers experienced all of them. If this has given you a new perspective on medieval history, or if it's helped you understand something about the nature of warfare more generally, then maybe these forgotten soldiers' stories have served a purpose. After all, take care of yourselves out there. Remember to like and subscribe if you want more history that doesn't sugarcoat the past, and sleep well, knowing that you'll never have to experience what those medieval soldiers went through. Their wars are over, their suffering is done, but their memory deserves to live on, honestly told, for as long as we remember that history is made by real people paying real prices for other people is decisions. Good night.